Okay, it's going now.
Okay. All right, thank you for your patience.
Okay, I'm fired.
I don't know if any of you are keeping track, but this is the 32nd lesson in the Gospel of John. And final, but it is the 32nd. I had no idea when I began how long it would take. Because, as I told some of you at the beginning who were here, I have never taught the Gospel of John before. I've preached on some passages from John, but I'd never taught the book, so I didn't know how long it would take. Every lesson that I prepared, I had to kind of figure out how much an hour was and then, break it off there. But here's something you might appreciate. Anybody ever heard the name Martin Lloyd-Jones? He's a very famous author. Well, I'm always looking for new material, and I found on a Martin Lloyd-Jones page, he had, you ready for this? 108 sermons on chapter 1. On chapter 1. I've asked Paula to listen to all of them and, glean things for me, but that's amazing. I mean, I thought John MacArthur was the worst at that, but Martin Lloyd-Jones lays him in the shade. So anyway, 32 lessons. I mentioned to you that the climax of the gospel is what we covered last week, when Thomas says, in response to seeing the marks in Jesus, "My Lord and my God." John told us what his goal was. He would give us a sufficient number of signs, not all of them by any stretch, but a sufficient number of signs so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. That's verses 30 and 31 of chapter 20. And that would have been a great place to end the gospel. Chapter 21, in a very real sense, is an epilog. Now, I listen to books that I download on my phone from the library, and oftentimes after the book is over, there will be an epilogue. And sometimes it's relevant, and sometimes it doesn't seem relevant at all. John's epilogue, I think, has some relevance to the gospel. But because it's an epilogue, and because it comes after the finale and the stating of the purpose of the book, there are some scholars who believe that chapter 21 was not originally a part of the gospel. And you can make a case for that. Opposed to that idea is that there has never been any manuscript of the Gospel of John. Speaking of manuscripts, we're going to start next week on how we got the Bible. And you'll have more about manuscripts than you'll possibly ever want to know. Okay? But there has never been any manuscript evidence where the Gospel of John appeared without chapter 21. So I believe that if it wasn't in the very original, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, it certainly came to be shortly after chapter 20. Okay? So I think that there are some things that John felt like, you know what? And maybe based on what was being said around the churches, he even mentions that. Did you know that the early church had rumors? Can you imagine rumors in church? That just doesn't seem to be possible, does it? Okay, we'll talk about that too. But chapter 21 deals with one of those rumors, something that needed to be said. Now, it was important for Jesus, after he was raised from the dead, to demonstrate to his disciples that he really was alive. And when we talked about, things that people say that try to disprove the resurrection, hallucinations and so forth, it was 40 days. And Luke, because he wrote both the Gospel and the book of Acts, begins the book of Acts, verses 1 through 3, and verse 3 is the one that I want us to notice. After his suffering, this is Jesus, he presented himself to them, and he gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. Now, I don't know the difference between a proof and a convincing proof. You know, can a ghost do this? I don't know. I don't know. But he did enough to demonstrate clearly that he was indeed alive. Luke calls them convincing proofs, and he did them over a period of 40 days. And that idea of 40 days, get that in your mind, it's almost 6 weeks. And it has a relevance to the story that we read about in chapter 21. Now, we have looked at his appearances in John to several women, especially Mary Magdalene. Thank you. I thought for a minute I'd stumbled into the wrong room and that you'd never had a class in John before. Especially to Mary Magdalene. She didn't recognize him at first until he called her name, and then she was just so ecstatic to see the Lord. And then he appeared to the apostles when Thomas was not there, and then he appeared the next week to the apostles when Thomas was there. Okay? That leads to the finale, my Lord and my God. But I don't know how long after that, but Matthew 28 indicates that Jesus had told these disciples to go to Galilee, specifically a mountain in Galilee, and wait for him to come. Are you any good at waiting? I'm terrible at waiting. I'm terrible at waiting at traffic lights. I don't like to wait. I'm not going to do that. Anyway. But apparently some time had passed. Okay, so when he appeared to Thomas was 7 days on the 8th day after his resurrection, 7 days after his resurrection. Maybe a week has gone by. Maybe 2 weeks have gone by. I don't know. John just says, after these things. Okay? So, there's a group of disciples, I guess all of them, I don't know. But they start talking about, when is he showing up? And finally, Simon Peter and Thomas, called Didymus, and Nathanael, who was from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, we remember who they are, right? James and John, the author, so he's in on this, and 2 other disciples were together. I've often wondered, if you were one of those 2 other disciples, and you're reading this, you go, what? We had names. Why weren't we mentioned? There were these 5 guys and 2 others. They were together, and Peter said, you know what? I'm going fishing. And the other said, sounds good to us. We'll go with you. Now, I don't think that was in the original plan the Lord had in mind for the disciples. I don't know why he delayed in coming. He hasn't told me about that yet. I plan to ask him about it. But apparently they got a little antsy and decided, what could it hurt to go fishing? Now, when you went fishing in the Sea of Galilee, you weren't really recreational fishing. It's not where you found a lure that you'd think would work, this kind of thing. Fishing was hard work. And fishing was done normally at nighttime. There would be torches or lantern type things on the boat, hopefully to attract the fish. You would take a net, you would spin it around and fling it out there, and the weights would go down, and then you would start to haul it in. And they had done that for a living, for years. This is how they made their living. And I don't think Peter means, you know what, I could use a little recreation. I think he means if Jesus is not going to come, we have to live. We need to go fishing. Now, I promised John a map. I know you love my map. It looks something like, I'm going to put it over here.
You won't never see
Because
it.
I've got stuff I want to put. You won't see it over there?
Can you see it? Okay. I
Okay,
did a good job
we'll
then.
put it here. Whoa, is that ever nice?
That's the best you've ever done on that.
Oh, man. And of course, this is the Mediterranean, as a child of 4 can plainly see. No, this is not a colonoscopy picture. That's not what this is. This is like, it's Galilee. Does it have any other names? Tiberias? Well, that's not even close. And there's another one. Whoops, 2 N's. Gennesaret. It's sometimes called Gennesaret, but it's always the same lake. It's this one right here. And you have, I think, Bethsaida is over here. Capernaum is over here. That's where some of the apostles were from, and it's possible that Capernaum was Jesus' home after he moved out of Nazareth, which is somewhere right about here, something like that. Okay, so this is the lake. And most of these guys are very familiar with this area, and they're very familiar with how to fish in this lake, okay? Keep that in mind, because I think it's important to the way the story develops. So, all of a sudden there's a stranger on the shore, you remember the tune, and he asks them a question. They're about 100 yards away, but water's a good carrier of voice. And he hollers at them. He doesn't say, have you caught any fish? That's not what the Greek says. The Greek says, you haven't caught any fish, have you? And they respond with a full paragraph, no. He said, why don't you try the right side of the boat? We don't know who this guy is, and he's talking to experienced fishermen who know the lake like the back of their hands. And I know that Peter's thinking, how do I know this? I just do. Oh yeah, that's right. The fish only like to go on the right side of the boat. Like they communicated with each other and said, you know what? If we get on the right side of the boat, I think we'll be fine. But there's nothing of that recorded. That's nice. They throw their nets on the right side of the boat. And they let the weights drift down to the bottom, and then they begin to pull. And when they do, wow. This net, or these nets, are absolutely full of fish. And it's reminiscent of another story in the Gospels. I think I gave you reference for that in Luke chapter 5. This was before the calling of the disciples, where Jesus told the fishermen to cast out into the deep, and that's where they get the fish. And they did, and they started to bring them in, and it says there were so many fish that the nets began to tear. They filled both boats almost to the point of sinking. And do you remember what Peter said to Jesus on that occasion? He said, depart from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. For Peter, it was such a miracle that whoever is calling them to do that has to be somebody special. And it's on that occasion where the Bible says they left everything and followed Jesus. Later on, the disciples would ask the question, well, we've left everything. What are we going to get? Well, decent question, but indeed, they had left everything to follow Jesus. So, but on this occasion, John says, when they start hauling in the fish, there's a little mini miracle in that the nets don't even tear. Apparently, when you have a load of fish like this, it's not uncommon for some of the threads in the nets to break. But no, they didn't break. John is the first to recognize Jesus. He says, "It is the Lord." And we're not surprised, Peter is the first to act. Now, if your translation says that Peter was, I think in Texas it's naked. There's an A in there, people. Naked. Okay, so Peter is naked, but that's what the word means is undressed. But he probably still had his loincloth. You know, the other guys would go, "Peter, put your loincloth on. Come on." So I don't think he's naked, like some translations say, but he wraps his robe around him, which you need for swimming. You can't swim without a robe. And he jumps into the water, and they're 100 yards out. I don't know how long it took Pete to get to the shore, but he did get to the shore. Now, by the way, for some reason, John mentions that there were 153 large fish that were caught that day. Did you hear that, Paul? 153 large fish. Paul likes to fish. He's a good fisherman. I say that because he shared fish with Paula and me, and I'm giving him a plug on basically. There have been so many different speculations about this number, 153. Ooh, what does it mean? What secret is held in the 153? Even the early church fathers were enamored with the number. I'm not making this up now when I tell you. One of them said the 100 is for the Gentiles, the 50 is for the Jews, and the 3 is for the Trinity. Duh. Here's another one you might like. There are 10 commandments and 7 gifts of the Spirit. That's 17. And if you write out the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then add them all up, guess what it adds up to? 153. So that's where that came from. I am here to tell you what the number 153 stands for. Are you ready? It stands for the number of fish they caught. And now you know. John is just somebody, I think, who likes to mention details. When Jesus did his first miracle, he says, you know, there were 6 large pots standing there. Well, who cares if they're... Ooh, 6. In 6 days, God... No! There were 6 pots, and John wrote that down. And I think that, you know, when you have a large catch of fish, any serious fisher people in here? Don't you count them? Don't you count them? If I say, Paul, I hear you had a great day out on the lake. How many fish did you catch? Yeah, quite a few. No! He'd tell me how many he caught. John said that day, and they weren't little ones either. They were big ones. 153 fish, and the nets didn't even begin to break. Now, when they come to the shore, they find that there is anthrach. You know, Paula misspelled this word. That's why it's hard for me to pronounce it. There's supposed to be an I after the K. Are y'all in the same place I am? Anthrachion. There's an anthrachion there on the shore. That word appears only twice in all the New Testament. And the other one, as I showed you in the scripture, is John 18:18. Did anybody bother to look that up? That's the charcoal fire that Peter was standing beside when he was asked about Jesus. This is the only other time in Scripture that Peter is standing beside a charcoal fire. And that is going to have significance, obviously, for the story that is coming. On the charcoal fire, Jesus is somehow grilling fish, and he has bread as well. Don't think of Mrs. Baird's big loaves. You know, it's pita bread type stuff. It was typical. Fish and bread for breakfast. That was a staple of their diet. But Jesus has it ready on the shore. He even says, bring some fish. I think he means, in case somebody wants seconds, you know. And people ask the question, well, where did he get fish and bread? And I say, did you not read John chapter 1, verse 3? Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Did you not read the second miracle where Jesus had a boy's lunch with bread and fish and just fed the whole multitude? You know, in my mind I can see how he did it, but it doesn't matter. He has the charcoal, he has the metal grate. I don't know how you charcoal fish back in the first century, but he's doing it. And he invites the disciples to come and have breakfast. Now, I don't really understand verse 12. Did y'all read verse 12? Let's read verse 12 if you haven't. It says, whoops. Paula, did you give me the wrong verse? Just a minute. Yes, the latter part of verse 12. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. What? Now, I don't dare ask John who he is because I know it's John. You know? Now, I've mentioned to you before that I believe that in some ways the resurrection body of Jesus, although having a clear resemblance to the pre-resurrection body of Jesus, was somehow a little different. And I think he looked just a little bit different, but not enough different for the disciples not to recognize him, and yet different enough for them to think, is that really him? But nobody asked, right? So it was probably kind of an awkward breakfast. Could you pass the fish, Jesus? If that's, I mean, yeah, you're Jesus, yeah. But strange. No one dared to ask him who he was because they knew who he was. Like I said, I don't understand verse 12, but apparently John did when he wrote it, or else he wouldn't have written it. John points out in this section that this is the third time that Jesus had appeared to a group of apostles. Remember, there was the evening of the resurrection morning. There was a week later with Thomas. And I don't know how long they'd been waiting on the mountain. But now for the third time, Jesus appears to a group of the apostles. And the scene is set for something that was very important in early church leadership. And I want us to read it together. It's beginning in verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. But again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now, most of you know that the Greek language has different words for love. I'm only going to mention two of them because they're the two. This is the noun form. That's not agape, it's agape, okay? Is it fair to assume that at one time or another you've heard this? Okay. And normally speaking, this is thought of as brotherly love, or as in Philadelphia, brotherly shove. But it has the idea of affection, brotherly affection. And this word normally is a higher word, you might say. It's the word that is always used, I believe, when it talks about God's love for his creation. But it is a word also that has to do with the will. You decide to do something because of your agape. You may not even feel like doing it. Have you ever had to try to forgive somebody that you couldn't stand? That takes agape. I don't feel like it, but this is what. Now, some of you have heard this story, and I apologize to you who have heard it, but I'm going to tell it again anyway. I don't remember many sermons from my youth, but I remember one. And I remember it was on a Sunday night, and I know the preacher. I can see him in the pulpit. I can hear the preacher. I know the preacher's name. I'm not going to repeat it. It doesn't matter. But he was preaching on this passage. And he said it's a wonderful passage because Jesus asked Peter, do you agape me? And by the way, did you notice, do you have an NIV? Some of you have an NIV. The NIV translates that truly love. Did you see that? They're trying to raise the bar a little bit on love. Do you truly love me? Do you agape me? And he said, well, yeah, Lord, I phileo you. You sure? And the second time, this is from the preacher when I was a kid 14. Do you agape me? And once again he said, well, I do this, yes. And the third time, Jesus said, do you agape me? And finally the light dawned on Peter, and he said, oh, that's what you're looking for. Yes, I agape you. And I thought, listen, this is bad. I thought, I want to do that. I want to understand that. I want to know that. I want to study that. I want to preach. That sermon, I'm telling you, had a pretty strong influence on my decision to preach and teach the Bible. Because, man, when you learn the language, you could really get great stuff out of it. Except that it's not true. That's the only flaw in this. And I didn't find that out until, I don't know, 6-7 years later, and I was crushed. I was crushed. And in my mind, I'm trying to figure out, did you get misled? Did you mislead us on purpose? You know, what happened? Because, sure enough, Jesus says, do you? And he said, I do. Do you? And I do. But the third time, Jesus says this word. And Peter agrees with him and says this word. Peter doesn't change the word he used. Jesus does. Now, what kind of significance are we to attach to this? Well, I don't want to burst any bubbles because, that stuff enamored me for a long time. But it should be remembered that when Jesus and Peter are having this conversation, they're not having it in Greek. They're having it in Aramaic, which is a form of Hebrew that was used at the time. Now, it may be that they used words in Aramaic that John says, this is the closest to that Aramaic word, and this is the closest to that Aramaic word. I don't know. He doesn't tell us. But they're not speaking Greek. They're speaking Aramaic. Some scholars have offered evidence and that in the Gospel of John especially, there is no real distinction between philos and agape. Hey, you can't do that. Well, yeah, you can. You can use them in the same way if you so choose. John didn't say at the beginning, by the way, please note that I have two different meanings for love. He just uses the word, and they're translated love. Or if you have an NIV, truly love. The third thing I want you to notice is that when Jesus says, do you agape me? Peter says, what is the first word he says? Yes. Well, he should say, no, no, I don't agape you, but I can go as high as philos. You see? He doesn't disagree with Jesus at any time. He just says, absolutely I do. Yes, I do. Or he doesn't say, I wish you hadn't set the bar so high because this is all I can jump over. They're both words for love. Do you love me? Yeah, I love you. Do you love me? Yeah, I do love you. No, do you love me? And Peter is hurt. And some commentators who want to make a distinction say the reason why Peter is hurt is because Jesus drops down to philos. And that's what hurt Peter. I would suggest to you that John tells us why he was hurt. Because he asked him for the third time the same question. You know, if a spouse asks another spouse, do you love me? And asks 3 times in a row, I think the other spouse is going to say, how long are we going to do this? And the other spouse says, until you get it right. Apparently, I've listened in on some conversation. But anyway. So, I think I decided I want to read something out of Verge. Yeah. Just to prove I read stuff. Talking about the fact that there doesn't seem to be much different, it says Leon Morris, and that's this commentary, by the way, that I'm using from my microphone. Leon Morris echoes this sentiment. There's no difference on the grounds of Johannine usage for seeing a difference in meaning between these two verbs. The focus of Peter's conversation with Jesus has to do with his commission to tend the flock of Christ, not the quality of his love for him. Peter is thus upset not because Jesus has changed the verb for love, but because Jesus has asked him the same question for the third time. And the same sort of comment can be said for the charges given to Peter following the affirmation of love. Once again, there is a variation, but these word shifts bear no theological importance. Jesus commissions Peter 3 times to care for his flock. One time he says, feed my lambs, the next tend my sheep, and the third time, feed my sheep. Attempts to find deeper meaning in the connections among these words should be viewed with the utmost caution. So, sometimes John just changes the word up so that it won't become repetitive, and maybe that's what he did with these. We can't be sure. But I have to back up. You see, the first time Jesus asked the question, it was a little different from the second and the third. Did you notice any difference? Not in the word. The first time Jesus said, do you love me more than these? More than these. Well, I have nearly all my life believed that Jesus was referring to the fact that at one time Peter had bragged that his love was better than anybody else's. By the way, Paula didn't get that right in there. I wrote, he could be referencing the proud boast he made in, and I think it just ends there. I've worked with Paula all these years, and it's in 13:37 of John. It's in John 13:37 where he says, you know, I want to follow you now. I've laid down my life for you. But then there was supposed to be a comparison. If you compare Matthew 26 and verse 33, Matthew 26:33, that's where he says, even if everybody else deserts you, not me. So I've always believed that when Jesus said, do you love me more than these, he means, do you love me more than these other men love me? Do you still feel that way, Peter? And one of the things I noticed in Peter's response is he avoids that like the plague. He doesn't say, yeah, I love you more than these. Well, I hope I love you more than these. He just said, I love you. Come on. He avoids the comparison. What could more than these mean? Well, this one's silly, but it could mean, do you love me more than you love these other guys? Because I told you to wait on the mountain, and here you are fishing with your buddies. You love me more than your buddies. I don't think that's what he means, but it could mean that. The language doesn't take that away. But what I think it really might mean is, do you love me more than these? And he may be pointing to the fish and the boat and the nets. Peter, I told you to wait on the mountain, and now I find you doing what? Fishing. I know you were fishing when I called you, and now I delay for a little bit, and what are you doing? Fishing. Do you love me more than the fish and the nets and the boat, this industry of fishing? You have got to decide, Peter, because I have work for you to do, and it doesn't involve fishing. At least not for fish. Because Jesus had once said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. But in this case, Jesus said, you are going to have sheep to take care of. Jesus had already described himself as the good shepherd, and the good shepherd hears the voice of the sheep, but when he's gone, the sheep are going to need help. They're going to need tending and feeding, and Peter, I'm going to have to count on you to do that. But if you love fishing more than you love doing work for me, then we've got a problem. Do you love me more than these? I don't know which of those John meant. But the application that I'm going to make at the end has to do with that one. So I just wanted you to accept that as being a possibility, at least. Okay, where am I? Oh, we're doing good. Maybe John felt like this story had not been told, but the story of how Peter had denied Jesus 3 times had been told, and people need to know this. People need to know that Jesus went out of his way to reestablish Peter as one of the leaders in the church. Okay? Because don't you think the guys talked about that? Did you hear what old Pete did? He didn't just deny him. He said, damn, I don't know that man. He cursed. Wow. We didn't expect that from Peter. And I don't know how that affected Peter's place in the group. But Jesus knows that Peter's got some work to do, and he wants to reestablish his right to do that work. And his work if you went into the book of Acts, you would know that in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, who gets up to lead in the preaching? It's Peter. A guy who had cursed and swore and said, I don't know the man, was allowed to preach. It's a good thing he wasn't divorced. That's all I can tell you. Don't be bitter, Don. Because that sometimes affects a preacher more than denying the Lord. So, in asking him 3 times and giving Peter a chance 3 times to confess his love, it brings Peter back into the position that he needs to have. Now, Jesus next offered a prophecy about Peter that was certainly ominous in tone, and I'm going to read it. I should probably read more often because I count on you all to read it. I should read more often. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself, this is verse 18, and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Oh, by the way, John says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Remember that Jesus, shortly before the cross, talked about glorifying God in what he was about to do. And the death that Peter is going to die is not simply described as a death. It is described as Peter's way of glorifying God. When you were a teenager, Peter, I know you drove your parents crazy because you'd come in late and get up when you wanted. And anybody do that when they were a teenager? It's not going to be like that, Peter, when you're old. The phrase stretching out your hands was often used as a way of describing crucifixion. And when it says someone else will dress you, I don't think that means he's so old he can't get his clothes on. That could be translated, and I think it should, bind you. It has to do with, I don't think it means girding him. I think it means taking a hold of him, binding him. You will be bound, and you will have your hands stretched out. And John said, unless anybody misunderstands, he was talking about how Peter was going to die. And tradition has it, when the time came for Peter to be crucified, he said he wasn't worthy to die just like his Lord died. So would you turn him upside down to crucify him? Now, that's not in the Bible, but it is a tradition that has existed way, way back. That Peter did that because he felt unworthy to die exactly in the way that Jesus died. Here's something to think about. One commentator suggested that this could be considered good news by Peter. Because now he won't have to worry about failing under pressure again. There was nobody who showed more confidence than Peter. I can handle anything. No, you can't, Peter. And I think most of us would think, I wonder if that could happen again. What if I'm put in a position where I either have to choose Jesus or death? What am I going to do? Jesus says, I'll tell you what you're going to do, Peter. You're going to choose death. You, like the book of Revelation says, will be faithful unto death. You can have the confidence that you won't let me down again. You won't fail when the situation gets difficult. You will die and bring glory to God in the way you die. I kind of like that myself. Does anybody know the song, O Sacred Head? I'd sing a little for you, I really would, but it is a mournful song written in a minor key. It is so sad sounding. But one of the verses says, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to you. I don't know how long I'm going to live, but I hope I live a short enough time where it won't go past my love for Jesus. You could look that up on YouTube and play it. After about one verse, you'll say, whoa, that's awful. Because it's mournful. It is a very mournful song. Okay, I'm moving because my timekeeper's getting antsy over here. So, Peter manifested a human personality trait that most of us have, and that is a curiosity about others. Jesus ended the conversation about love by saying, follow me. Now picture this. Here goes Jesus, and Peter's following, but he goes, Lord, what about him? Now, Peter and John were good friends. They had run to the tomb together. They did a lot of stuff. They fished together. They did a lot of stuff together. And sure, okay, I'm going to die. What about him? And I'm paraphrasing. No, I'm not paraphrasing very much. It's pretty much right on. What is that to you, Peter? Or, what business is that of yours? Do you need us? Oh, okay. What business is that of yours, Peter? And then he said, if I decide that he will live until I come again, that's my business, not your business. Follow me. And Peter said under his breath, I wish I hadn't asked. Because he got upbraided for that. Mind your own business. You got enough on your plate following me. You don't have to worry about him. And then John says, oh, you know what happened as a result of that? There was a rumor going around the early church that Jesus was going to come before John died. Can you imagine a rumor in a church that's not true? Did you hear that that Evelyn's daughter is pregnant? Bless her heart. See, if you say bless her heart, you can say nearly anything, right? Well, it may be that Evelyn's daughter is not pregnant. Just like this rumor wasn't true, maybe we need to hear what Jesus said. What is that to you? Don't you have enough on your plate following me without spreading rumors about other people? Not that any of us would ever be involved in such. Bless our hearts. And maybe one of the reasons why John wanted to tell this story, this is speculation. Not everything I say is speculation, but this is. I can see John growing older and older. And I think when he wrote this, now, I don't think he's on the Isle of Patmos yet. I think he's still in Ephesus, where John was a cherished church leader in the city of Ephesus. And I believe that as the church there watched John get older and older, and still Jesus hasn't come, John said, well, no, wait a minute. I could still die before Jesus comes, because that rumor got started, and it shouldn't have, because that's not what the Lord said. He just said, that's my business if that's what I decide to do. Not that that would happen. And I went, oh, okay. So you might be dead before the Lord comes. And he was. He was. So, almost done. Oh, and this is the verse I wanted you to notice, and you probably have a better explanation for it than I do. Verse 24, notice. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Now, that could be John taking literary license and simply referring to himself in the first person plural instead of singular. Or it might be that the leaders of the church in Ephesus see this being written by John and they said, yeah, here is a guy that shoots straight. We know that he tells the truth. It may be their testimony to John telling the truth. I don't know. If that upsets you, study some. It wouldn't bother me if a group of church leaders wanted to throw something into John's letter. It wouldn't bother me a bit. And then he closes by saying, it's a good thing John didn't try to write everything down, because I doubt the world would be able to hold all the books. Hyperbole, but it gets the message across. John picked stuff to write about, enough for all of us to come to faith. So, we are able to see from John's gospel the kind of response from us that Jesus is seeking. First and foremost is that he wants us to believe that he is truly the Christ, the Son of God. That's what he said in his purpose statement. But firm in that belief, we are to serve him, to obey him. There was a couple of passages there in chapter 14 where Jesus strongly emphasized obedience. It's not just a matter of willy-nilly. We're supposed to take the commands of Jesus seriously. But at the end, we hear Jesus asking each one of us the most searching of all questions. Do you love me more than these? Now let's say, for Peter, it would be fishing. I doubt it would be fishing for most of us. Do you love me more than golf? I know, John, I'm sorry. Do you love me more than golf? Do you love me more than cruising on the high seas? Do you love me more than your spouse? And Paul is going to hear this. Do you love me more than your grandchildren? Now we've really gone to meddling. Jesus was not afraid to challenge his disciples to say, I need to be preeminent in your life. You don't always hear from the pulpit that kind of thing. Christianity is just a nice add-on to your life. Jesus once said, if anyone doesn't hate their father and mother and brother and sister, they can't be my disciple. So I'm telling you, when Jesus says, do you love me more than these? Whatever the these are for you, I've got my own these. We have to decide whether we love him more than these. And Peter's final response when he says, Lord, you know everything, didn't he? You know everything, so therefore you know that I love you. He still does. He still knows everything. He knows how seriously we take him. He knows how our hearts yearn for him or not. So we need to keep that in mind. That's all I've got to say about that.